Hello, everyone. Today we are going to explore Blavatsky's model of the mind. This is a quite complex subject. I have written a book about this that is titled Evolution of the Higher Consciousness. But we can look at the main features to understand the different levels and complexity of what we call mind. Most students of theosophy are familiar with the sevenfold constitution of human beings. Here in the slide, I'm taking what we may call the middle principles. We don't have the lower that involve the physical body and other principles associated with it, or the highest principle, the self, ātman. We take the middle ones because Blavatsky said that here is where consciousness develops. If we go beyond the higher of these principles, we go to a state that is beyond consciousness as we understand it. She called it conscious non-consciousness, trying to convey by means of this paradox something of the idea of what that state at the ātmic level is. But let us look at these middle principles, which are called buddhi, sometimes translated as spiritual soul, then manas, which is the mind as we tend to understand it. All these components are part of what we call consciousness. But one of the main characteristics of manas as a principle is that this is the source of a sense of I-ness, the source of what we call ego. And then there is kama, a Sanskrit word that means desire, which is sometimes translated as animal soul. The reason for this is that in the animal kingdom, kama is developed and awakened. And then in the human kingdom, manas is developed. So sometimes manas is also called the human soul. And then toward the end of the human evolution, we will awaken the spiritual soul or buddhi. Now, manas, this principle that sometimes Blavatsky would call the principle of mind, is divided into two levels, the lower manas and the higher manas. The lower manas is what we normally understand as mind, in the sense of the level in which thinking takes place, the level from which our intention or desire or will come from. And there is a higher aspect of this principle that is a kind of spiritual mind, is a mind that is beyond the brain and the senses, which we are going to explore. So Blavatsky says the mind is dual in its potentiality. It is physical and metaphysical. The higher part of the mind, what she calls the metaphysical mind, is connected with the spiritual soul or buddhi, and the lower part of the mind with the animal soul, the kama principle. This is from the collected writings. So what she is saying here is that the higher part of manas often can work in connection, in union with the higher state of consciousness that is buddhi, forming what she would call buddhi manas. And then the lower part of the mind can work in connection with kama or desire. And she would call this complex kama manas. So here we have described two levels of consciousness. The level of buddhi manas, when the higher mind works in union with buddhi, we will see that buddhi, the word buddhi comes from the same root as Buddha, and it means the seed of awakening or enlightenment. So when manas works in union with buddhi, we have what we could call the divine mind. Blavatsky uses this term sometimes, the enlightened mind. Then we have the higher mind. The higher mind we will explore can work on its own level without being united with buddhi. But per se, the higher mind is a mind, as she said, the metaphysical mind. It's the mind that perceives things that for the lower mind are abstractions. It perceives unity, it perceives harmony, love, etc. And the lower mind, the lower manas, is the thinking mind. The thinking can also be enlightened by the higher principles, but I mean the thinking mind as it manifests in most of humanity. And it can be a quite intellectual mind. Suppose a person is dealing with a situation, and the emotions or desires may not be involved there. There is just the use of the mind to figure something out. That would be the work of the lower mind. But then we saw that lower manas can work in connection with kama, with desire, as kama manas. And that would be the desire mind. This desire mind is the one that drives a large portion of our mental activity. That is the mind that is seeking pleasure, fulfillment, is running away from pain, etc. So we have here so far, because there will be more, 4 levels of consciousness in which what we call mind may work. So let us explore them a little more in detail. The higher mind, Blavatsky says in her conversations with a group of students on the Secret Doctrine in a book that is called The Secret Doctrine Commentaries, says that in its own inherent nature or essence, or that means on its own plane, the higher mind is omniscient, for it is part of the divine mind. And in several writings, Blavatsky points to this fact that the higher mind, which is one that operates beyond the body, beyond the brain at this point in evolution, on its own plane, a plane that is beyond the physical, this is the level of who we are as a soul. That mind is omniscient in the sense that whatever the mind perceives on its own plane, it perceives that correctly. There is no room for error on that plane. Now, that omniscient mind, as we are going to see, when trying to operate on the lower planes and on the physical plane, then it loses that omniscience. But on its own plane, the higher mind has this ability, not necessarily of knowing everything. She calls it in another place inherent omniscience, which means that it doesn't know everything, but anything that it knows it right. It can see the reality on that plane in particular. And now she says, but once that that mind has been brought to reincarnate on earth, it takes up all the materiality and all the finite attributes, so to say, and the qualities of the personalities that it incarnates in. Which means that what I just said, that when that higher mind, which on its own plane is omniscient, begins to express itself through the lower principles and finally through the brain, it loses that omniscience. It is limited. It is limited by the senses. It is not able to perceive things as they are on the physical plane, etc. And that gives rise to what we call the lower mind. Now, let us look a little more at this state of consciousness that we call the higher mind, or the higher ego also is called sometimes. This is our soul, or we ourselves as a soul on the higher manasic plane. what's the state of consciousness of the higher ego? And Blavatsky says the real ego does not think as his evanescent and temporary personality does. In the thoughts of the real man, and man she uses in the sense of the word is, the English word is derived from the Sanskrit root, and from which the Sanskrit word manu also is derived. Manu means the thinker. So Blavatsky used the word man as the thinker. So he says, in the thoughts of the real man, of the higher ego, not the lower ego that is the one that psychology knows about. This is, the word ego means I-ness. There is a lower I-ness, a personal I-ness, that is the one that psychology deals with. But there is a higher I-ness that is far subtler, more spiritual, on the higher manasic plane. And this is the higher ego that Blavatsky is referring to here. So in the thoughts of the real man, or the immortal individuality, the pictures and visions of the past and future are as the present, nor are his thoughts like ours, subjective pictures in our cerebration, but living acts and deeds, present actualities. So while we are familiar with what thinking means at the level of the lower mind, as it expresses through the brain, thinking at the level of the higher ego means something completely different. To begin with, there is no separation of time in the sense of past, present, and future. As far as the future has been already created through karmic actions, that future is evident to the higher ego, to the higher mind. Same as the past is always available to the higher mind. And any thought at that level is an action. An action on the higher mental plane is thought, or thought is action. Thought produces an effect, produces forms, produces transformations in the environment around. And this is how the higher ego acts, by thinking. That, of course, is different from the experience of thinking that we know at the level of the lower mind. In fact, she says that the lower mind is the seat of the human quality of thinking, or animal cogitation, and is rationalized owing to the superiority of the human brain. It is the lower mind is the kama tending, or lower manas. So in another, this is from, these two quotes are from the Key to Theosophy. In another place, she says, the thinking principle is only a little higher than the instinctual element in the animal. So evidently, she didn't think much of the ability to think as it manifests through the lower mind. She says, because the brain in a human being is far more developed, then that instinctual intelligence that is in animals, it becomes the ability to think in human beings. But they are not all that different. And we know that the lower mind many times acts moved by what we could call instinct. The instinct for self-preservation, the search for pleasure, the running away from pain, etc., etc. So that's the lower mind, especially when it is connected to the kamic principle. She says that the lower mind is kama tending. It tends to follow kama, or desire. So as long as the lower mind is following desire, the ability of thinking is quite basic, and is just an enlargement of instinct. As the person grows incarnation after incarnation intellectually, there comes the possibility of a kind of thought that at least at times is not influenced by the desires. So that would be a more pure thinking belonging to the lower mind, as opposed to kama manas, that is when the lower mind works along with desire. And then she says, there are persons who never think with the higher faculties of their mind at all. Those who do so are the minority at this point in evolution, and are thus, in a way, beyond, if not above, the average of humankind. These will think even upon ordinary matters on that higher plane. I think this quote is important to point to the question that the lower thinking that we are accustomed to and that we see normally manifested in most humanity is not the only kind of thinking that is available even at the level of the brain. We know that on its own plane, beyond the brain, the higher mind is omniscient. But as the person learns to connect to the higher principles, then that person may begin to use even the brain mind, let's call it brain mind, the mind that manifests through the brain. That person may be manifesting the higher mind through the brain. As she says here, these people will think even upon ordinary matters from that higher plane. And some manifestations of this, just to give an example, would be when we look at the world in terms of cooperation instead of competition, compassion instead of violence, etc., etc. That kind of thinking does not come from the mind that tends toward the desires. That kind of thinking comes from the higher mind, which tends toward enlightenment, toward buddhi, as we saw in the diagram earlier. Now, in Theosophical literature, there is the idea that there is a bridge between the lower and the higher minds. There is something that can bring consciousness from the lower mind, a state in which the person is only aware of whatever the senses bring, is caught in their identification with the body and the emotions and the thoughts in the ego. It's driven by desires. There is the possibility to raise our consciousness from that state into that of the higher mind. And that possibility is there because there is a kind of bridge. Now, this bridge is not a real structure. It is a metaphorical bridge. And this was called by Blavatsky antakarana. The antakarana is a Sanskrit word that means the inner organ. Now, she explained the antakarana is a portion of the lower manas, is a portion of the lower mind, which is one with the higher, the essence, that which retains its purity. On it, on the antakarana, are impressed all good and noble aspirations, and in it are the upward energies of the lower manas. So the idea here is that in this lower mind, there is a part of the mind that tends toward the desires, as we saw, the kama tending part of the lower manas. But there is an aspect of the mind that always retains its purity, she says. There is a part that always remains in tune with the higher mind. And there is in the lower mind the possibility of vibrating in harmony with the higher. And that aspect of the lower mind is what she calls antakarana. So antakarana is part of the lower mind, but it's that part that aspires toward the spiritual, toward the higher. So she explains a little more here antakarana is active only during those moments when the lower manas aspires towards its higher half, toward the higher manas, and thus becomes the medium of communication between the two, between the lower and the higher consciousness. So whenever our lower mind aspires toward the spiritual, then we activate that aspect of the lower mind that Blavatsky called antakarana. And that aspect of the lower mind becomes the medium of communication between the two, because that antakarana, which sometimes she called manas antakarana, that part of the lower mind, being in tune with the higher can bring perceptions of the higher. And since it is part of the lower mind, it brings the perceptions of the higher into the lower consciousness, into the lower mind. So whenever we have an inspiration, whenever we have something that is coming from the lower nature, or whenever we aspire to the higher, all that is done through the antakarana. If we don't use that function of the mind at all, Blavatsky says it can atrophy, and then the person cannot think of the spiritual, cannot receive spiritual inspiration. And on the contrary, the more we use that part of the mind, the more active it is, and the more readily it brings inspiration from the higher, and it generates an aspiration toward the higher. So she says the lower consciousness mirrors aspirations unconsciously to itself, and then itself aspires and is elevated if things are in accord. Such an aspiration would be a tendency towards theosophy. This instinct, if developed, becomes a conscious aspiration. So the antakarana there at the beginning is unconsciously to the person, is pushing the person toward the spiritual. And as we become more and more aware of that inner urge to follow the spiritual, then that aspiration becomes conscious. As she says, this instinct becomes a conscious aspiration. So our love for the spiritual, for theosophy, for the right action, all this happens through that antakarana aspect of the lower mind. And in the more it happens, the stronger this aspect of the mind is. So now we have one more state of consciousness to the four that we had described. We have the highest, that is the divine mind. We will see some of it toward the end of the talk. Then we have the state of consciousness of the higher mind itself, that is omniscient on its own plane. We saw, let us jump from the second to the fourth, we saw the lower mind and the desire mind. And between the higher and the lower mind, there is this state of consciousness of manas antakarana that we can call the aspiring mind. So the way to transition from the lower to the higher mind is by stimulating the aspiring mind, stimulating it by means of meditation, by means of seeking virtues, by means of helping others, etc. Anything that tends toward the spiritual, toward unity, is strengthening that state of consciousness of manas antakarana that we may call the aspiring mind. So let us look at the divine mind. We have explored briefly all the other states of consciousness. Now, at this point in evolution, spiritual aspirants are strengthening the manas antakarana, the aspiring mind, seeking to awake to the reality of the higher mind. And as that begins to be accomplished, there is a further step in which the higher mind aspires to unite with buddhi. And then we have there what we call buddhi manas, the divine mind. So let us explore this in more detail. Blavatsky describes it as following. Spiritual knowledge or esoteric wisdom is a knowledge not attainable by ordinary intellectual processes. And by intellectual, she often includes both aspects of manas, the higher and the lower. That's the intellect. There is a higher intellect and a lower intellect. So she says the spiritual knowledge or the esoteric wisdom is not a knowledge that can be attained by ordinary intellectual processes, but it is only to be gained by mystical enlightenment or the awakening of the buddhic elements in man. So as we grow in our spirituality, we need to start awakening the buddhic principle in us. And it is the activation of this buddhic principle which starts bringing true spiritual knowledge. Not knowledge of spiritual things, because that knowledge can be just intellectual knowledge, but spiritual knowledge, which means wisdom, true wisdom. So then she says in the key to Theosophy, buddhi manas is the revelation of the divine, which comes from buddhi, plus human intellect and self-consciousness. We all have the buddhic principle in ourselves, but most of us are unaware of it. The source of self-awareness is manas, because manas is attracted and is united to desire and to the body. We are aware of our body, our emotions, and of the thoughts themselves, of lower manas. But as manas begins to aspire to the higher and begins to touch buddhi, that means that we begin to be aware of buddhi in us. We begin to be aware of the qualities of buddhi, which buddhi is the source of wisdom and love and compassion, and enlightenment. So in this way, in the union of manas and buddhi, we are uniting wisdom with awareness. Another way of saying it, we are becoming aware of the inner wisdom that is in us, of which most of us are not aware at this point in evolution. Now, before there can be a complete union between buddhi and manas, there is an intermediate state. For a long time, we touch buddhi momentarily, and then manas comes back to its own center of consciousness. And then it touches again buddhi, and then gradually it comes back. But as evolution proceeds, this connection between manas and buddhi begins to increase until it becomes permanent. Now, the temporary state in which manas begins to get in touch with buddhi was called by Blavatsky manas taijasa. Taijasa is a Sanskrit word that means, as she says here, taijasa means the radiant. It means radiant or brilliant. And it means the radiant in consequence of its union with buddhi. That is, manas, the human soul, is illuminated by the radiance of the divine soul, or buddhi. Therefore, manas taijasa may be described as radiant mind, the human reason led by the light of the spirit. So the manas taijasa is a mind that is being illuminated by the divine mind. Of course, the mind that can be illuminated by the divine mind is the higher mind. The lower mind that is limited to the senses or that is interested in personal desire, etc., is just not in tune with buddhi, with the divine aspect in our nature. So that mind cannot be illuminated by buddhi. But when we begin to strengthen the antakarana, and when the higher mind begins to be more and more predominant in our consciousness, then that higher mind starts aspiring toward buddhi. And every time that there is a connection, we have the state that is called manas taijasa. This is a temporary state, as I mentioned. Blavatsky says, remember that if it can be said of buddhi manas that it is unconditionally immortal, the same cannot be said of taijasa, which is merely an attribute, because it is the same manas, only with the light of buddhi reflected on it. So when the union is complete, when we get what is called buddhi manas, we have an adept, we have a person that that the seat of his or her consciousness is the divine mind, and that is not a temporary state, that is a constant state. But before that, we have taijasa, manas taijasa, the manas illumined temporarily by buddhi. So here we have one more state of consciousness that is available to human beings. We see between the first and the third state, the first one being the divine mind, buddhi manas, and then the third one is the higher mind, and manas taijasa, which we can call it the illumined mind, the mind that is illumined by buddhi. It's a temporary state that we can aspire to. Perhaps we may touch this state in meditation, in a deep study, in being inspired by compassion or love, etc. So here we have a kind of map of consciousness from the desire mind, the mind that is just a vehicle for the satisfaction of desires. As a person evolves, then there are more intellectual interests that may draw the mind away from desire, or the person learns to look at certain things without the influence of desire, and that's what we can call the lower mind. Sometimes this is called the concrete mind. Then we have the aspiring mind, which is when that lower mind starts looking beyond itself toward the spiritual. And that leads us into the higher mind, the mind that is able to perceive as real these principles that may feel like abstractions for the lower mind, the principle of unity, of wisdom and compassion. All these things begin to be a reality in the personality when the higher mind begins to guide the personality. And then that higher mind may touch the Buddhic principle, and then we have the illumined mind. Now we are talking about a mind that is the mind of a sage, perhaps not a fully enlightened person, but a person which often can act from an enlightened point of view, until that union is made complete, and then the human being expresses the divine mind. So to finish this talk, we will see briefly what's the principle to induce this kind of connection between the higher manas and buddhi. We said that by the aspiring mind, the aspiration to do the right thing will take us to the higher mind. And what will take us from the higher mind to buddhi? Blavatsky said, when the individual consciousness is turned inward, a conjunction of manas and buddhi takes place. In another writing, she said, in the act of self-analysis or self-examination, the mind becomes in its turn an object of perception to the spiritual consciousness. When we begin to examine our own minds, then the normally in our daily life, the mind is the one that observes, that thinks about the world. But when we start looking at the mind itself, it is the spiritual consciousness that begins to look at the mind. This is what she says next. The subject that perceives the mind as an attribute of itself is this transcendental or spiritual ego, buddhi. So the basic principle is that whenever we start turning our attention inward, then a conjunction between higher manas and buddhi begins to take place. Any activity of self-knowledge, self-observation, self-examination, meditation, in which we are turning inward, we are beginning to approach buddhi. And then the state of consciousness of buddhi manas, of the divine mind, was described by Blavatsky as follows. The spiritual ego, she used this word for buddhi manas. The lower ego is the one that happens at the level of the lower mind. The higher ego is the one that happens at the level of the higher manas. And then the spiritual ego is the one that happens at the level of buddhi. So the spiritual ego reflects no varying states of consciousness. So at the level of buddhi manas, there is a peace, there is a stability, there is a quietness, silence. That state is not affected by all the movement and the variation of consciousness that we experience in the lower nature. It is independent of all sensation or experience. It is independent, whatever is happening in the lower nature, it doesn't really affect the level of buddhi manas. This is the source of poise and peace and harmony in whatever external environment. In this state, there is no thought. It does not think, she says. It knows, but by an intuitive process only faintly conceivable by the average man. So the idea here is that the divine mind, remember we saw that the thoughts at the level of the higher mind were very different from the thinking in the brain. Those thoughts are actions, there is no limitation of time, there is omniscience. Well, at the level of buddhi manas, we transcend thought. There is a pure awareness which knows without the need to think, without the need to analyze, without the need to connect different facts. There is just silent perception and a direct awareness of what is being perceived there, of the reality of what is being perceived. So it's this intuitive process that is very difficult to understand. So in our spiritual life, as we move from the aspiring mind into the higher mind, and we seek to get our higher mind in touch with buddhi, all activities of turning inward will help us in that endeavor. And eventually, as we can access the Buddhic state of consciousness, we experience a state of pure, quiet awareness. And this is why many mystics and theosophical teachers always advise to go toward the silence, to seek for that state of consciousness, first in deep meditation, and then also in daily life. Seek for that state of consciousness that is rooted in silence, in a quiet perception that is beyond thought and conditioning.